lacking a handout, you need I made extra copies just in case. Wanted to do an overview of the book of Second Samuel before we actually begin to do a chapter by chapter study. In fact, I'm going to take it a little bit different. I think there's 24 chapters in the book of Second Samuel. Going to take a different approach. We may be looking at a couple of chapters at times just simply because of the narrative, and it would be necessary to do that. Well, when you think about the book of Second Samuel, here's the thing you need to keep in mind. The focus of the entire book of Second Samuel is on King David. Okay? The focus of the entire book is on King David. It is a book that has to do with his 40-year reign as king over Israel. And in fact, if you look at with me, if you will, at 2 Samuel chapter 5, 2 Samuel chapter 5, and lock in on verses 4 and 5, we're actually given some detail as it relates to his 40-year reign. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 4 says this, "And David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah." Okay? Now, here's something I think that you might find interesting. You think about David's reign. David's reign, or that 40-year period of David's reign as king of Israel, is almost right in the middle between the time period for Moses and Jesus. Okay? So the time of Moses to the time of, we're just talking about chronological here, from the time of Moses to the time of Jesus, the time period for David is basically right in the middle of those two. Okay? Same number of years before, same number of years after. We're really, really close. Well, who wrote the book of 2 Samuel? How do we know that Samuel didn't write 2 Samuel? He was already gone. He was already deceased. Okay? Anybody have any guesses on who wrote 2 Samuel? If you have a study Bible, it may even tell you. At least there's speculation of who wrote it. Anybody? There is some speculation that Nathan, the prophet, if you'll remember, after David sinned, God sent a prophet by the name of Nathan to go to him, and he gave him a hypothetical situation and said, "David, what do you think ought to be done with that guy that did that?" David said, very upfront, "That guy deserves death." To which we have that infamous statement from Nathan, "Thou art the man." Okay? Well, where does this speculation come from? Hold your finger there in 2 Samuel and turn, if you would, to the book of Chronicles. Okay? Kings and Chronicles go pretty much hand in hand. In fact, when you read through the book of Kings, you read through the book of Chronicles, you think, didn't I just read this? 1 Chronicles chapter 29. Look at verses 29 and 30. It says, "And now the acts of King David, first and last, indeed, they are written in the book of Samuel the seer." And then we're told in the book of Nathan the prophet, and the book of Gad the seer, and with all his reign and his might, and the events that happened to him, to Israel, and to all the kingdoms of the land. You say, well, there is no such thing as a book of Nathan. Certainly not in our canon, in our English Bible, or in our either Hebrew Bible as well. But we get a lot of the data that we find seems to come from Nathan, from his perspective. Okay? So, again, can't prove it. The Bible didn't tell us one way or another. The Bible doesn't specifically say, hey, Nathan wrote this book or some other person wrote this book. But there's speculation that Nathan the prophet wrote it, and that speculation is based upon 1 Chronicles 29, verses 29 and 30. Well, what's the theme of the book of 2 Samuel? The theme is simply this, that his triumphs turn into trouble through sin. Triumphs turn into trouble through sin. I think you would agree with me that it serves as a great lesson for all of us, just as it did in the book of 1 Samuel, because all sin eventually results in trouble. Agree or disagree? Now, here's something that's very interesting that I find about the book of 2 Samuel. You think about the theme, and you'll see this as we get to the end. Right here in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, we begins with a poem or a lamentation. David is mourning the death of Saul, okay? And here's something you'll find. Not one time in all of the book of Samuel, think about this, David is mourning the death of someone who was trying to kill him. And this first chapter is really kind of a poem, this lamentation, if you will, over Saul. And not one time throughout the entire book of 2 Samuel will you find David speaking ill will of Saul. He doesn't speak down about him not one time in the entire book. Now, for us, we'd probably say, well, I'm glad that guy's gone, right? Or, hey, that guy did this or that guy did that. David not once referenced that. Okay? But here's the interesting. It begins with a lamentation or a poem, but it concludes with a plague. In fact, if you go to the very last chapter, 2 Samuel 24, verse 15, verse 14 says this, and David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Please let us fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great, and do not let me fall in the hand of man. And then verse 15 through 17, watch what it says. This is pretty significant. So the Lord sent a plague upon Israel. God's judging his own people. So the Lord sent a plague upon Israel from the morning till the appointed time, from Dan to Beersheba. And how many people died? 70,000 men of the people died. And the angel stretched out his hand over Jerusalem to destroy it, and the Lord relented, that is, he stayed his hand from the destruction, and said to the angel who was destroying the people, it is enough, now restrain your hand. And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. Then David spoke to the Lord when he saw the angel who was striking the people, and said, surely I have sinned, I have done wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand, I pray, be against me and against my father's house. I think it's a reminder that God takes sin seriously. And somebody, was it, man, I'm drawing a blank tonight. R.G. Lee, who preached the famous sermon called Payday Someday. And it was a reminder that God's payday don't always come on Friday. You know, while we think, well, man, why is God allowing them to get away with this? Why is God allowing that? Mark it down. God's not allowing it. He's not condoning it. Judgment's coming, but in his time. So it begins with a poem or a lament. It ends with a plague. Here's something else that I want you to make note of when we think about the book of 2 Samuel. It contains... we think about the various covenants. We think about the Mosaic covenant, the covenant that God made with Moses. You've ever heard the phrase or the term Davidic covenant? The Davidic covenant, we're going to look at it just here in a moment, and what God promises to David. It's one of the most important things. In fact, one of the most important things you'll find in 2 Samuel is this Davidic covenant. What is the Davidic covenant? The covenant is a promise or agreement that God made with David. Promise or agreement that God made with David. In fact, let's look at it. What is it? What does it contain? We'll get into it in a few weeks. But I want you to see it firsthand tonight. 2 Samuel chapter 7 is found in 5 verses, or 6 verses. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 11, is this covenant that God makes with David. Y'all follow along as I read aloud. Here's what he says. He says, since the time that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and have caused rest from all your enemies, also the Lord tells you that he will make you a house. Now, watch what here it is. He says, when your days are fulfilled, okay, that is when you have lived your life, when your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, that is when you die, here's what he says. I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish what? His kingdom. And he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish his throne. And here's the key, here's the kicker, here's the covenant. For how long? I will establish his throne, or the throne of his kingdom forever. There's the key. Verse 14. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. And if he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, and with the blows of the sons of men. And by my mercy shall not, but my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall be established again forever before you, and your throne shall be established forever. Now, what is God saying here? God is saying to David that his kingdom, that his throne, his lineage will reign forever. And so that immediately raises the question, well, where is this fulfillment? What's the basis of this fulfillment? Was this a promise from David to just Solomon, or did somehow God fail to keep his promise to David? Well, here's what you need to remember about the Davidic covenant. It's very important that you remember that it's a promise that the seed of David will have a kingdom and he will reign forever. Also remember this, God always keeps his promises. For if God fails to keep his promises, guess what happens? He ceases to be God, okay? In fact, I want you to hold your finger there in 2 Samuel 7 and go with me to the New Testament and look at Luke chapter 1. Luke's Gospel chapter 1. You'll think, why isn't this not being fulfilled? Well, it has and will be fulfilled. Matthew, Mark, Luke chapter 1. Lock in on verse 31 and 32. It says, and behold, you will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. It's good for us to say Jesus in church. Amen. Verse 32, and he will be great and will be called the Son of the Highest, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. You trace the human lineage of Jesus. You can trace it all the way back to David. And so ultimately, this promise that God made to David is going to be fulfilled in the Lord Jesus, and Jesus' kingdom will last forever. And all of God's people said, one day indeed Jesus is going to come back, and he will indeed rule and reign on the throne of David in Jerusalem. Okay, so if you're looking at the Davidic covenant, it's in verses 11 through 16. We'll go in a deeper dive when we get there here in a few weeks. Okay. Well, what is the outline of the book? The book can be divided into 3 sections. The first section is in chapters 1 through 4. The second section is in chapters 5 through 12. And the third section is in chapters 13 through 24. What is the first 4 chapters about? If I could give it a title, I would call it this. I would call it the patient years. The patient years. I mean, think about this. Way back in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, David is anointed to be the next king of Israel by the priest, by the prophet, by the judge Samuel. But he had to wait a long time, did he not? And so now his patience is being fulfilled, if you will. In chapter 1, we see David mourning over the life of Saul. And again, I want to reiterate to you that not one time does David speak ill will of Saul. In fact, he mourns over him. This is a guy who's mourning over someone who tried to kill him time and time again. And then chapters 2, 3, and 4, David is still dealing with some of those relatives and some of those leaders who served under King Saul that may potentially be a fly in the ointment to the reigning of King David. And so that's what you have in chapters 2, 3, and 4. So chapter 1, you have the lament of Saul. Chapters 2, 3, and 4, he's dealing with those who were left over from the house of Saul that may potentially cause him problems. So we say that chapters 1 through 4 is the patient years of the reign of David. Chapters 5 through 12, we're going to call those the prosperous years, the prosperous years. In fact, in chapter 5, we see the coronation. David is made sole king of the entire land. Chapter 6, we see that David has some convictions, right? Chapter 7, we just talked about the Davidic covenant. Chapter 8, we see the conquest, some victories that God provides for him. And I'll tell you this, when you get to chapter 9, I really am looking forward to when we get to chapter 9. You say, what's so special about chapter 9? Chapter 9 is what I really believe is one of the most beautiful chapters in all the Bible. What's it got to do with? It has to do, if you remember in 1 Samuel, there was a time that Jonathan, Saul's son, acknowledged David to be the next king. And David made a covenant with Jonathan, and Jonathan made a covenant. Look, I'm going to do this for you. And David says, I'm going to do this for you, including looking after and taking care of Jonathan's family. Well, you know, Jonathan had a young boy by the name of Mephibosheth. Y'all remember that? Who was being taken care of, and then when his, nurse or the handmaid, it was taking care of him, she heard that the people of David David was coming there to do good. She got fearful and was trying to run with him. And remember what happened? Yeah, she fell, and as a result, what happened to Mephibosheth? He became crippled, really a permanent crippling, right? And so what does David do? David pretty much adopts Mephibosheth as his own son and treats him like a prince. Lets him eat from his own table. And so just a beautiful picture of the covenant that David had made with Jonathan and the keeping of that covenant. Chapter 10, David's going to get some critics. And then chapters 11 and 12, you see the heading there? Anybody have any idea what we're talking about? Bathsheba, and not just Bathsheba, Uriah. Remember that? David commits one of the most heinous sins, not just adultery, but he has a man murdered to cover up his adultery. So if chapter 9 is one of the most beautiful chapters in all the Bible, I would submit to you that chapters 11 and 12 might be one of the ugliest chapters in all the Bible. Saddest, most definitely the saddest, right? And that brings us to the last portion of the book of 2 Samuel, not just the patient years, 1 through 4, the prosperous years, 5 through 12, but chapters 13 and through 24 get to be really treacherous. I'm going to call it the perilous years. The perilous years. Chapters 13 through 19, we see David's battle with his kinsmen. In fact, he has a son by the name of Absalom who rebels against him and tries to have the kingdom overthrown, and David removed as king and Absalom installed as king. And that leads to a tragic death of Absalom, if you remember that. And then last but not least, we see the kingdoms, chapters 20 through 24, and basically God's judgment because of sin. Any questions or comments? Wanted to give you an overview of the book of 2 Samuel, and I hope that you're going to participate with me in the coming weeks as we do kind of a chapter-by-chapter study. I think it'll be every bit as good as what we just saw in the book of 1 Samuel. It won't take us nearly as long, again, because I'm going to take on more chapters because of the narrative demands it. Okay? So for those of you that joined us, we're going to bid you adieu as we take some prayer requests. Thank you for tuning in with us tonight, and I pray that you have a blessed rest of the week. Stay warm. My understanding is